Welcome to the Synthesis of Yoga, the book that changed my life. We are going through part 1, chapter 7 of the Synthesis of Yoga, Sri Aurobindo's major work synthesizing all the yogic traditions. We are reading line by line, and the very act of reading is sadhana, because Sri Aurobindo's yogic consciousness is infused into these texts, and the rhythms of these lines imprint in a recursive, repetitive way deeply into the underlying patterns of his consciousness. So in a way, we are reformatting ourselves by reading him line by line. Now, in the last episode, in this chapter, we saw that the infinite, the divine consciousness that is flowing through humanity, and when we want to live in the freedom of the spirit and obey that truth, we cannot expect that divine consciousness and that truth to fit into and obey our social norms and codes of conduct. Nor can we expect our codes of conduct, any of the social codes of conduct, to be absolute and sacrosanct. Once we understand that, we begin to see that all social codes of conduct are temporary constructions in a world that is rapidly changing. When we are able to constantly update and change our codes of conduct according to the changing, dramatically changing world, we are beginning to align with the world march of the divine consciousness that is transforming the world. And our normal codes of conduct distinguish between good and evil. It is bound by the duality. But when we go to the divine consciousness, the duality ceases, because behind good and evil, when we remove all their limitations, distortions, and ignorance, we see the divine essence. Once we see the divine essence, we will also see everything as a place in the whole scheme of things. It's a matter of right quantity in the right context. So with that, now we move on to the new episode 91, and we are starting with paragraph number 6 of this chapter, and you can find the link in the description. Kindly follow the text so that we can enjoy it together line by line. Sri Aurobindo's lines are generally very long. I am breaking it down to smaller chunks so that it is easy to understand its rhythm, its pattern. To those who can act only on a rigid standard, to those who can feel only the human and not the divine values, this truth may seem to be dangerous concession, which is likely to destroy the very foundation of morality, confuse all conduct, and establish only chaos. So on one hand, it is very easy for us human beings to understand and recognize our social norms, laws, rules, regulations, the reason why they are there. And on the other hand, it's very hard for us to understand what are the divine values. And if that clarity is not there, and when we can only see the social norms and regulations as real and other one as very vague thing, we may feel that it is a dangerous concession to consider that the divine consciousness, or let's say our social norms and social moral conducts, are to be abandoned in order to discover the divine truth. Now, that can be a dangerous concession which is likely to destroy the very foundation of morality, confuse all conduct, and establish only chaos. So, if we are not able to sense the divine values, isn't it going to be dangerous to say that social norms, rules, regulations are to be looked upon as temporary constructs and constantly to be modified, are we going to run into chaos and run into losing the very foundation of a morality of our society? So, to those who can act only on a rigid standard, there are people who need definitions. This is what the law says. This is what the protocol says. And I can follow a protocol very clearly. Without protocol, I'm very lost. Those who can act only on rigid standard, to those who can feel only the human and not the divine values, this truth may seem to be a dangerous concession which is likely to destroy the very foundation of morality, confuse all conduct, and establish only chaos. Certainly, if the choice must be between an eternal and unchanging ethics and no ethics at all, it would have been that result for man in his ignorance. We are in ignorance. We are creatures of ignorance. In that condition, if the choice is between an unchanging ethics and no ethics, these are two extremes. An ethical standard of conduct that is unchanging, on the other extreme, no ethics, absolute freedom. If this is the choice, then yes, certainly. If the choice must be between the eternal and unchanging ethics and no ethics at all, it would have that result for man in his ignorance. That is, we will end up with chaos and loss of the very foundation of the morality of the society. That's a true danger. We need to acknowledge, recognize, and see that we don't operate with this extremist mindset. But even on the human level, if we have light enough and flexibility enough, light and flexibility enough, to recognize that a standard of conduct may be temporary and yet necessary for its time. A standard of conduct may be temporary. Doesn't mean we don't take it seriously. It is necessary scaffolding. Therefore, important to create those standards and follow those standards. A standard of conduct may be temporary and yet necessary for its time. There is a time period where it is relevant. And to observe it faithfully until it can be replaced by a better, then we suffer no such loss, but lose only the fanaticism of an imperfect and intolerant virtue. So once we recognize that we have formed the standards of conduct and it has a limited time period and we faithfully follow it till we find something better that can replace it. If this is not done, or if this is done, then we suffer no such loss. Then there is no reason for chaos to set in or moral foundations of the society to break down. Because we know codes of conduct are there, even if they have a limited time allocated to them. While it is in place, we must follow them faithfully so that we suffer no such loss but lose only the fanaticism of an imperfect and intolerant virtue. So there is a tendency of making the rules, regulations, social norms and customs into an intolerant virtue, something that we impose with fanaticism, whether it is dress code or all sorts of social codes of conduct imposed by religious leaders and various types of leaders. That kind of fanaticism and intolerance, that's what we need to drop, and yet be open to codes of conduct that are temporary knowing that it is temporary and something new can be brought in when time comes. But even on the human level, if we have light enough and flexibility enough to recognize that a standard of conduct may be temporary and yet necessary for its time, and to observe it faithfully until it can be replaced by a better, then we suffer no such loss, but lose only the fanaticism of an imperfect and intolerant virtue. In its place, we gain openness and a power of continual moral progression, charity, the capacity to enter into an understanding sympathy with all this world of struggling and stumbling creatures. And by that charity, a better right and a greater strength to help it upon its way. Moral progression happening in the world. Morality of humanity is evolving. And once we understand that there is a continuous moral progression and our standards of conduct are temporary, from there comes certain openness. We gain openness. With that openness, the power of continuous moral progression, charity, and the capacity to enter into an understanding sympathy. This understanding sympathy, knowing that everything has its temporary role to play. Every creature is stumbling their way through, and in that context, everything has its place, even if it is temporary. So from there comes the empathic understanding and the sense of deep charity and the capacity to enter into empathic relationship with all this world of struggling and stumbling creatures. And by that charity, a better right and a greater strength to help it upon its way. So in that perspective, we will be in a better position, better strength to help this progressive journey. However stumbling it is, however struggling it is, we find the possibility of helping the world to progress morally, ethically, even when the standards of conduct we know are temporary constructs. So we drop our fanaticism, sense of sacrosanct absolutism with any social norms and rules and regulations, yet we see it with compassion, see that it is a temporary necessity, and we follow it faithfully as long as it is needed. And we do see the moral progression of the world when we replace old conducts with new ones in alignment with the divine will. Therefore, we develop the empathic understanding, charity, strength to help the struggling world to progress step by step. In the end, where the human closes and the divine commences, where the mental disappears into the supramental consciousness and the finite precipitates itself into the infinite. A very interesting line. The finite precipitates itself into the infinite. All evil disappears into a transcendent divine good, which becomes universal on every plane of consciousness that it touches. So when we make that transition from being human to the divine, our mental consciousness transitions from its narrow limits to supramental consciousness. When that transition happens, that is when the finite, we, the little one, individuals, precipitates itself into the infinite. We melt and merge with the infinity. It is there we experience the spiritual freedom and the truth of that spiritual consciousness and being, which will reveal the truth the divine essence of all things, including what appeared as evil. The divine essence of all things become visible from that lens of the infinity. Then we see everything has its right place, right context, right proportion, right quantity. And that divine good, which becomes universal on every plane of consciousness that it touches. So we know the lower planes of existence, mental, vital, physical. In all these planes, when the higher supramental consciousness, as it comes down and touches, in every plane of consciousness, the divine essence of all things gets revealed, things fall in their right place. That is how we transcend the normal moral codes of conduct. It is not a violent rejection of everything. Abruptly, there is a progression of morality in the society. There are temporary constructs that we faithfully follow, but drop when things are no more required. Better ones are found. In the end, where the human closes and the divine commences, where the mental disappears into the supramental consciousness and the finite precipitates itself into the infinite, all evil disappears into a transcendent divine good, which becomes universal on every plane of consciousness that it touches. This then stands fixed for us that all standards by which we may seek to govern our conduct are only our temporary, imperfect, and evolutive attempts to represent to ourselves our stumbling mental progress in the universal self-realization towards which nature moves. Nature is moving towards not individual self-realization, but universal self-realization. Earth herself becoming conscious of herself. Not the human individual alone, in which she is conscious, self-aware. From there she is breaking the mold, and that self-realization becomes collective and universal. Towards that evolution is progressing. And in that journey, in that evolutionary progression, the moral progress, standards of conduct, they are temporary constructs having its role to play for a limited period of time, however imperfect they are, but they are evolutive attempts. So this then stands fixed for us that all standards by which we may seek to govern our conduct are only our temporary, imperfect, and evolutive attempts to represent to ourselves our stumbling mental progress. So our mind needs representations through various social codes of conduct that is derived from our experience of life, but still they are representatives. Out of that we create our rules, regulations, represent to us our stumbling mental progress. Mental progress is stumbling and struggling our way through. And towards what? It is moving towards the universal realization towards which nature moves. So far, spirituality had been about individual liberation. Now that is coming to an end. With the supramental world that is manifesting, there is a universal realization, universal self-realization towards which nature is moving. This manifest nature, particularly earth nature, earth consciousness is shifting, in which we individuals are participating, but it is a universal self-realization that is in the making. This is a huge difference from understanding of traditional spirituality. It was always concerned about individual liberation, not the universal self-realization. But the divine manifestation cannot be bound by our little rules and fragile sanctities, for the consciousness behind it is too vast for these things. The divine manifestation cannot be bound by our little rules and fragile sanctities. We consider many things to be of sanctity of our rules, regulations, laws, dharmas. They are actually very, very, very fragile. We may consider them to be very eternal, timeless, but many of them are very, very fragile sanctities. And our little rules, for the consciousness behind it is too vast for these things. The universal self-realization and the divine force animating all these things is too vast for our little mental constructs to understand, comprehend, and put into rules and regulations. It doesn't work. The divine manifestation cannot be bound by our little rules and fragile sanctities, for the consciousness behind it is too vast for these things. Once we have grasped this fact, disconcerting enough to be the absolutism of our reason, disconcerting enough to the absolutism of our reason, we shall better be able to put in their right place in regard to each other the successive standards that govern the different stages in the growth of the individual and collective march of mankind. So once we begin to grasp this large march and our reason and mental progress and its limited understanding and the need for temporary standards of conduct that is to be upgraded all the time, so that different stages of our evolution can be governed by different rules and regulations, so that individual and collective march of mankind can continuously progress. Once we understand that, then we know the right place of social codes of conduct and the right place of spiritual freedom. So once we have grasped this fact, disconcerting enough to the absolutism of reason, our rational intelligence has a certain sense of absolutism. I have found this rule, this law in nature, and it is absolute. That's how reason works. But for the divine consciousness, nothing is absolute. Even the so-called nature's laws from a spiritual consciousness, they are all habits, habits that can be changed. Once we have grasped this fact, disconcerting enough to the absolutism of our reason, we shall better be able to put in their right place in regard to each other the successive standards, version 1, version 2, version 3, that govern the different stages in the growth of the individual and the collective march of mankind. At the most general of them, we may cast a passing glance. At the most general of them, we may cast a passing glance. Yes, we need to look at them, but a passing glance, because these are also standards that will come and go. But when they are there, we take them seriously. Time is over, we drop them and move on. Or we have to see how they stand in relation to that other standardless spiritual and supramental mode of working. So on one hand, we have the higher consciousness of supermind, where there is no such standards as we have in the rigid mental rules and regulations. And these two, what is the relationship between the two? We have to see how they stand in relation to that other standardless spiritual and supramental mode of working, for which yoga seeks and to which it moves by the surrender of the individual to the divine will. So when we are in yoga, we are shifting, we are surrendering our individual will to the divine will progressively and with a greater and greater perfection. In that transition, we are transitioning into a standardless supramental consciousness and its ways of doing things, which is very different from mental rule-based action. So our reference for action gradually shift into another mode of knowing, being, and doing, which yoga seeks to make that shift. Yoga seeks and to which it moves by the surrender of the individual to the divine will. And more effectively, through his ascent by his surrender to the greater consciousness in which certain identity with the dynamic eternal become possible. So when we are surrendering our individual will to the divine will, then there is an ascension into higher planes, into higher mind, illumined mind, intuition, overmind, supermind. That is the journey mapped out by Sri Aurobindo. This is the trajectory of humanity in its evolutionary ascension. In that ascension, we discover two sides of the eternal. One is static. That has been very well discovered and declared. We can see it in the teachings of Buddha, in teachings of Shankara. Then there is the side of the dynamic eternal who bridges the formless infinite with the manifold manifestation. The dynamic infinite manifesting the worlds. That is the link principle of supermind. It is to that which we ascend. And it has its own ways of doing things, which is far different from our mental rules, regulations, understanding, codes of conduct. This is the transition we are making. So individual will progressively surrendering to the divine will. And the divine will lifting the individual into a progressive ascension into higher and higher planes, all the way to supermind, which brings a dynamic power of the eternal divine Shakti that pours down, and it will work through the mind, the vital, the physical. And there, the rules of that action are something fundamentally different from our social, moral, ethical codes of conduct. So that transition is what yoga is aspiring for. Yoga is designed for, integral yoga in particular, looking at this transition into the dynamic eternal, not the static self-realization, but the dynamic, where manifestation itself is seen as a progression, a progressive revelation of the divine in the material nature, where spirit and matter gets harmoniously blended, a new equilibrium is established in evolution. That is the journey we are into, in which morality, social codes of conduct, these are temporary constructs. They are limited, built on limited impressions of the mind, limited representation in the mind of the greater will, greater action. Mind is narrow, it pieces together some picture. Based on that picture, it creates social norms, codes of conduct. Know that these are temporary constructs, version 1, version 2, version 3. We can use them as and when it lasts, drop them when better ones are found. That way we enable the progressive manifestation and the world march of the divine consciousness in the world. And through that we participate in the evolutionary adventure. So with that, we come to the end of this episode, which is a very short one. And I am seeing whether short episodes are much more helpful and easier for you to enjoy. So give me your feedback whether I should continue with the shorter episodes or longer ones, and which one is more easy to digest, enjoy, and progress on the path. See you next week. Thank you.